Hey Reema, thanks for coming on the podcast today.
Thanks, Shane. Really happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to our conversation today. You recently published a novel called Such Big Dreams, and it's a really fascinating story about kid and grew up quite this young woman or several people in India who work for this Justice for All firm doing, nonprofit work, and she was previously a street lady and things like that. And those are some of the ideas that, you and Ruff, and it deals with all sorts of themes like identity and survival and loss and um, status and wealth and all of these power and morality I will be discussing today because I think they're particularly important for our time right now. The world's a bit of a crazy place and there's a lot happening. Um, but I'd like to start off just with a little bit about, this book. It was roughly came after your experience of having been born in Canada to parents, or maybe it was grandparents that were originally born in India, and then you traveled there to do some work. Is that correct?
Yeah, more or less. My dad was born in India. My mom was born in East Africa,
Okay.
and all my grandparents are from India.
Oh, nice.
Yeah,
And you were born in
and yeah, the
Canada.
book did come. That's right.
Okay.
Yes, I was born and raised in Canada. Yeah,
So what was life like
yeah,
going to
and
see India?
yeah.
Sorry, there's a little
It's
bit of a
okay. There might be
delay.
a lag.
Yeah.
A little bit. I'll hesitate a bit before I start. What was it like going to India? So unlike a lot of my friends who are of Indian descent who grew up in Canada with me, I didn't spend summers going back to India to visit family because all of my family had left India and mostly were in the United States and the United Kingdom. So the first time I went to India was when I was 14 years old. And that was an immense culture shock. And I didn't actually go back until I was 20, 21 years old. And that was for an internship that I got in Mumbai to work with children who live on the street. And that was, probably one of the most pivotal times of my life because there I was, this 21-year-old who really knew nothing of the world, going in to work with kids who had, um, an upbringing that was so vastly different from my own in a place that I somehow thought would make sense to me because it was supposed to be the place that I was from in the narrative that had been, taught to me my whole life. Um, and I ended up, in of all the things I learned and all the experiences I had, one of the most profound ones I had was that maybe I didn't belong there in the way that I thought that I would. And it's sort of this, idea of having one toe in the West and one toe in the East, but never really belonging to either. And that was definitely something that I felt, working in Mumbai.
Being from both the East and the West is an interesting place to be in because you were raised presumably with a mixture of values, right? And going back to see your culture of origin, if that's the right way of phrasing that, was still pretty, culture shocking in the sense of how different it really is. I mean, what stood out to you as the most or the biggest differences?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, to speak on that whole,
Mm,
phenomenon, really, there's this literary trope that you sometimes find in literature of the South Asian diaspora called "The Return of the Native," and it's this literary trope in which you have a character who is either maybe born in India or the subcontinent of India, lives in the West, and then comes back, and that person perhaps glorifies, or maybe the opposite is fearful of coming back to something, but it's largely um, a myth in their head about the place that they've made up. So for me, going to India at the age of 21 to go work with kids living on the street, I was going there expecting a place that had been completely informed by people in my community in Canada, Indian people who had left India years ago, who imagined it to be something that it very much wasn't, or that I ended up finding out it very much wasn't. And to speak on that, you have these glorified ideas of the homeland, of, a place that's so much better than it maybe actually is, a place that's so much more harmonious. And I guess what I found was, India was so much more diverse, for one, than I knew it to be. India, for people who know, is about as diverse as the continent of Europe, or maybe even more so. So, the difference between someone from Portugal and someone from Scotland, it's the same as the difference between, where I'm from in India and where my husband's from in India. There's not a lot of similarity in the food we eat, the customs, the religions, the language, the dress, the music, the dance. So all that to say is I got there expecting people to speak the same languages that my parents did back home, only to find that, where I'm from in India, there weren't that many people in Bombay there that I came across. And so it was kind of a bit of a rude awakening. But what ended up happening was that it completely shifted the way, it shifted the narratives that I had been fed growing up, and allowed me to see this place for myself, and kind of confront some of the preconceived notions that I had.
And do you think that, those preconceived notions came from sort of romanticized or idealized versions from, predecessors in your community, rather than it being intentional misdirection?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, my parents had me in the 1980s, and I grew up in an extremely white neighborhood. I've seen my parents witness racism, systemic racism, offensive insults hurled at them by people on the street. So you can only imagine how, coming from a place where people look like you to moving to somewhere where they don't look like you, and you end up being on the receiving end of racism, how you could romanticize the place that you came from. So I think it's completely, natural that a lot of people in my community do that. What's interesting, though, is that I was going to India with two sort of collections of preconceived notions. So there was, the romanticized, idealized India that I got from the community, but then also the Western narrative of India being dirty, corrupt, poverty-ridden, and unsanitary. And so I had those sort of competing versions in my head. And yeah, so it was a lot of confronting both of those and seeing a place that is so much more complex.
Human life is infinitely varied and complex and diverse, and, and it's beautiful in many ways. And as you say, I mean, with there's roughly 1 billion people that live in India. I mean, the diversity you'll find there must be extraordinary, right? And incomprehensible perhaps to someone who has no idea, whose own exposure to Indian people in their neighborhood, or that they see on TV or at their school or whatever. And, at best it's a warm, welcoming kind of mutual interaction, and at worst it's, prejudicial and racist and horrible, and which is not good on anyone's part. Okay, so we had a bit of a technical difficulty, so if you picked up on that, my apologies. So what we were talking about is how, humans have very interesting pattern recognition brains, where we look for patterns in things unconsciously to make our making sense of the world a lot easier. And when we do this with people, we run into trouble a lot of the time, because we group people into, these categories, stereotypes and so forth, of being like, well, all of these people must belong to this particular pattern of people. And whether it's to do with the kind of person you are, what you look like, what your preferences are, where you come from, what language you speak, what food you eat. I mean, we do it with all kinds of things. And unfortunately, it also happens when we stereotype people badly, in the sense of it, harmful stereotypes. And that's not good for anyone, obviously. And, to think about the fact that people sort of stereotype India as a country with 1 billion people as if it could be so easily explained in a couple of sentences, the kind of people or the kind of place that it is almost humorous how silly it is to do that. I mean, we can barely do that for like 1,000 people, try and find common ground as, readily accessible for all of those people. And so, but I don't think anyone's doing it intentionally. That was the point that I was sort of kind of saying, was that it's just how we're kind of wired to make sense of the world. Having said that, your personal experience is what sort of trumps everything, right? Is as in, you knew all of these things, you heard the stories, you heard from your parents, from the people, from the media, all these different versions. And yet when you go there and you experience it firsthand, that's when you get a real sense of exactly what's going on and what's true and not true, at least insofar as your experience has shown you. Which stereotypes may be true some of the time here, but not there. None of them are true. I doubt all of them would be true. That would be that would be kind of crazy. And yeah, the diversity there must be amazing, right? As you said, like in Europe, the diversity between, Portugal and France or Wales, or it's like such different people. But at the end of the day, right, when you connect with people, the common humanity shines through, right? It's that we are all human at the end of the day. And culture and all sorts of things like that, make us different to large degrees on the surface, but underneath it all, it's still just human contact.
Absolutely. I mean, to speak on something you did say though, Shane, you said
Mm,
something to the effect of, you got to India and you saw, and personal experience trumps everything, and that's when you really learn what a place is like. I think one of the biggest takeaways that I learned, and I don't know if it's maybe by virtue of maturing considerably in the time that I was living in India, from since I left Canada. um what I learned, one of the biggest takeaways I learned, was that the the experience that you have is completely dependent on what groups you belong to, what social markers you have. And so, to be more specific, I'll give you some examples. So, um, you know, uh, whether you're white or whether you're brown, really. And then if you are brown, what color of brown are you? Are you a lighter shade of brown? Are you a darker shade of brown? The treatment that I would get walking into, let's say, a bougie cafe in India, in Bombay, would be different if the color of my skin was darker, for example. It
hmm
would be different if I was a white person. Um, and then, there's also the question of religion. What religion do you belong to? I remember trying to rent an apartment as a single young woman, and um, this is the first time I've ever really seen overt discrimination against gender in this day and age, because people didn't want to rent to a young single woman, and they were absolutely able to say that as the reason why they didn't want to rent an apartment to me. Um, and so, there were some buildings that I went to look at vacant units, and had friends who had gone to the same buildings, and they were Muslim,
hmm
and that was a flat out no from the building and the landlord, saying we don't want Muslims living in our housing unit, our housing complex. And so what I learned while living in Mumbai was that everything I was experiencing was being filtered according to the various identity markers that I had. And at the same time, there were things that were completely going over my head that I didn't realize, that I didn't recognize. And that's, not to get too deep into this discussion, but
No, go
that's
for it.
where the concept of caste really comes in.
Yeah.
Um, Caste is one of those things where the higher up you are in the caste system, perhaps the less you notice how insidious it really is. At least if are an Indian living in North America. Um, so for me, that was one of the things that I really just didn't think of because I don't belong to. I'm not at my family doesn't come from the bottom of the caste system. A lot of the privileges that I walked around with, I was completely unaware of because of where I fell in that system. And so, yeah, so to speak to your point about, our personal experience really informing how we see a place. Um, I think for me, it was acknowledging the subjectivity of that experience
Hmm.
and how it was mostly about me uh, with respect to the place than just the place itself.
Absolutely. And what's also interesting is how like two people going together will have or can have very different experiences, even though they technically are exposed to exactly the same stimuli or
Y-
experiences or whatever you want to call them. The way that
Yeah.
we process it and make meaning out of it, you know, is different. And that's okay, right? That's not a bad thing. That's
Mhm.
just a fact of our existence. Um, and it's important to sort of recognize that so that we don't project our reality onto other people and establish it as, the truth or whatever. I mean, we can have a debate about whether there is an objective reality, but perhaps that's for another time. Um, but I wanted to go back to your point about these identity markers, right? Because identity politics is a very big topic these days, and people are discussing it in all kinds of manners here in Canada and in many places in the world. And I think it has been sort of going on historically forever, but perhaps not as explicitly. It was more like an us versus them mentality, which is still technically identity politics of like the in group and the out group. We are right and they are wrong, and whatever that means, or we are the good and they are the bad or the evil. And so that's a weird part of human nature as well. That's not so great. And it's part of the sort of typecasting or stereotyping that we do to each other a lot of the time. Um, but what's fascinating is how the same makeup of you means different things in different places, right? So, like I read one of your articles where you were saying how, in Canada, you consider yourself, or I mean, factually speaking, you're a minority, right, to the majority white population that exists here. And yet you take yourself over to India, and all of a sudden, the skin color is, not debate, the skin color dynamics are very different because there the dominant skin color is brown of varying shades, uh, and so your fitting in to quote unquote fitting in there is different and depends, and it also depends on status and things like that and wealth, right? Which is very strange how all of these things come together, you know, like people who might have exactly the same skin tone but are dressed very differently will be looked at very differently. Whether we think that that's right or wrong is irrelevant, actually, because I mean it's wrong, but it's just how it is, right? If you see someone who's very well dressed, it doesn't even have to be extremely fancy. It just needs to be like well put together, nice, clean, like they just look like they put a lot of effort into that versus someone who doesn't. It influences how we view them. Now, perhaps it shouldn't, and it's good to be aware of these things in yourself because then you can stop yourself from making silly judgment errors. Um, But so what was your experience of sort of going back to India as a Canadian Indian? If that's, I don't know if that's the right way to say that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, definitely one of my earliest thoughts was I've never been in a place where my skin color is the same as everybody else's.
Hmm.
And that was a really profound, it was like I could breathe a sigh of relief, you know, because I wasn't automatically othered the way you are here when you're not white. When I say
Hmm.
here, in North America and Canada. And so that was a really interesting feeling, that I'd never had before. Um, I think you were speaking a little bit about, you know, identity markers and the treatment you might receive based on how you present yourself, how you comport yourself. Um, an interesting thing that I thought about when you were saying that was, when I was living in India doing this, international development work, I had friends who were from India. I had friends who were like me, Western foreigners, on these internships to do good in the world and pad up our resumes. And one of the friends I had, who was a great guy, was a white guy. And I remember this one time he and a few other friends of ours were going out, for the night. And, bars have dress codes, clubs have dress codes. And I remember, I guess we had gotten dressed up and he had shown up in like a gray t shirt and shorts and sandals. And I remember someone saying, they're probably not going to let you in like that. And um, to him, his skin color, he didn't say this outright, but his skin color, um, allowed him the leeway to, uh, not conform to the dress code. And he was
Hmm.
very confident saying, I don't need to put on shoes. I don't need to change what I'm wearing. They'll let me in, trust me. Um, spoiler, they didn't. But it was really interesting to see this level of confidence that the rules didn't apply to him because of the value that this particular identity marker gave him, his skin color gave him in this particular social situation,
Hmm.
in this setting. And so that was one thing that came to mind, when
Now
you asked about.
that kind of stuff's always fascinating, right? It's the sort
Mhm.
of um, it's one line of the sort of privilege conversation that not conversation, the privilege theories that are around, about how you need to think about and recognize privileges that you have, even if you didn't choose them or earn them. And then, I mean, ideally, you sort of work to deserve them is a good way of thinking about it so that you don't take them for granted or use them inappropriately. Um, but I mean, it always baffles me that someone would be, like, you go to a foreign place where, you're clearly the foreigner and the outsider, and you go in with an attitude of like, I can do what I want, like I deserve this, they'll let me in. Like, it's just such a crazy way of going about the world, right? And the crazy thing is, it works sometimes, not always,
It
but
well,
sometimes.
that's the thing. I don't know if this guy showed up showed up in India with that mindset. I think that the various interactions he had had in his time there had led him to believe that yes, this door will open for me
Hmm.
because it has 50 other times before. Um, and learning through his interactions with people that his skin, did afford him a level of privilege, um, and being aware of that, I think that's what informed his behavior that night,
Yeah.
his outfit that night. And yeah, India was a colonized, nation. It was colonized by the British, and I mean, there's tons of reading on how, for example, Western notions of beauty, um, impact, uh, you know, notions of beauty in the subcontinent itself.
Hmm.
It's one of the biggest skin lightening cream markets in the world, for example, just to scrape the surface of this debate.
Hmm.
And so yeah, it's, there is a value placed on white skin, and our dear friend learned that
Yeah.
very quickly.
And what's also, sorry, I have a dog here. He might bark. There was a noise. Um, Ted, let me just let him out. Okay, go see. Thanks, Joe. Go on. Um, what's interesting also is how, you know, colonialism, I mean, what a bloody mess, right? But looking at its after effects now is sort of where we're at. And what's always interesting to me is how deep rooted its effects go into the unconscious of the population, right? As you're saying. So, because a lot of people would say, well, once the colonialists leave, or I don't know what the right word is, give the stuff back, the land back, then it's like it's all good. And the sort of cultural influences are no longer there. Well, it's just simply not true, right? And people might not even be aware of it. And I think that what you said is a really great example of that, of how like beauty standards, which are varied from culture to culture, can be so influenced by those kinds of um, interactions and dynamics. And the crazy part about it is like how, well, to me at least, is that this friend of yours, like, he was treated differently because he had white skin, and he obviously perceived all of that as being treated better than, or well, or respected, or I don't know, can't speak for him, but I'm assuming he would use some of those kinds of adjectives, which gave him this sort of confidence of being like, I can do what I want here, kind of a thing. Um, and yet, it's interesting that that kind of happens even today, when you would think that people would be quite like against the white skinned colonialists, not like against any given individual, but against that sort of old way of, you know, that white is the highest level of whatever morality, not morality, of like status.
Mhm.
But that still pervades through generations, right? Which is why he's still getting this kind of preferential treatment. I think these days, though, probably money tops everything. In money and power, if he like went in with, I don't know, $1,000 just to give away, like, they wouldn't really mind what he wore. And anyone could do that,
Yeah,
which
I
is
mean,
crazy.
yeah, potentially,
Yeah.
but a lot of, one small example of um, one of the most, I think, striking examples for me of how skin color talks in
Mm,
India was going to visit a major tourist spot like the
mm,
Taj Mahal with some of these friends. And one, I remember being there with a friend, and crowds of people. And the Taj Mahal, if you've been or not been, is one of the biggest tourist sites in the world and in India, and it attracts foreigners, non-foreigners alike. It's considered affordable for Indians so that people can see it. Um, I remember going there
mm-hmm.
with I think this friend and some of his other friends, and all of a sudden,
I'm listening.
all of a sudden, he was swarmed. They were swarmed by people wanting to take selfies with them, and it was almost he.
Because
It's
he
not
was
like
white?
he's yeah. It's not like he's a celebrity doppelganger. It's not like someone thought,
Right.
oh, Brad Pitt's here. It was just the novelty and the obvious status that would come with having a picture with a white guy,
Right.
um, that drew crowds to him to take
Hmm.
pictures. And so that was, and those are the kinds of moments that do tell you that yes, your skin color has a value, and how are you going to use that currency in your time here. Um,
Yeah,
and so, yeah.
that's fascinating, and I've heard lots of stories like that of like, people going to various East Asian countries and having the same experience, whether they're black or white, uh, or brown, where it's just different, right? And I'm from South Africa, and I know stories of people who go travel to tribes that are still living relatively tribal existences, who like haven't seen white people before, and like all the kids get scared and they like think that they're seeing a ghost. And I mean, it's amusing, at that level, but it's fascinating that it just really does matter, because I think whether we like it or not, how we look to each other, it has an influence on what we think, right? And it's not a good thing. I don't support it, but it's not exactly something that's easily changeable permanently, right? I think that having diverse cultures makes it a lot easier, right? Like Canada, where you start to see it less and less as a defining factor of people. Not that it's not important, but just that it's by no means the most relevant aspect of a person ever, right? Like, why should it be? I mean, there's good and bad people who look like everything. I mean, who have all kinds of skin colors. Um, and it's just very interesting to me, and sad about how much of, I mean, the amount of atrocities that have happened based on skin color is just insane, right? And like South Africa is a prime example of that, the apartheid. Um, and it's just like, it's unimaginable. I mean, it's not really unimaginable because it's real, but it's just, for someone who's sort of not in it, I suppose, it's just very strange to even consider how one would get oneself into that position of power, right?
Hmm.
Not that I think it's impossible, because I also think that it's important for people to recognize how easy it is to get caught up in the sort of um, so-called oppressor role, right?
Hmm.
Uh,
And I think important to recognize that those kinds of machinations are very much still at work today,
mhm,
just in maybe slightly more modern ways. Um, you only have to look at, how
yeah,
Black and Indigenous people are treated in the criminal justice system in Canada and North America, or and the United States, to get a taste of that. Um,
oh, definitely. It's still alive is one way of putting it, but I mean, it definitely still exists. It's just people aren't being executed for it as much,
mhm.
which doesn't mean it's better. I mean, I guess it's a little bit better, but it's not gone or solved, right?
Mhm.
Um, and I wonder, do you think that these kinds of things can ever really be solved, or do you think that our nature is such that we divide ourselves? Do you think we could really ever be like one, like a human race without any division?
Like truly harmonious.
Yeah, like some utopian society. Like, because I don't think that's possible.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, uh, like, show me one place in the world that's like that. I
Yeah.
don't know. I don't think so. I mean, we were talking about India, which maybe to the outsider may look completely homogenous.
Hmm.
Um, a billion brown people, what could go wrong? Uh, Very much not true, right?
Yeah.
You have religion, you have caste, you have all kinds of forms of discrimination that people use to, um, I don't know, divide and conquer, and yeah, I don't know. I don't know what we're
Yeah.
capable of, really.
Yeah. Because I mean, I think it would be nice. I think the sort of best version that I can think of is some version where there is difference without persecution or judgment. Like, I think it's fine that people have different views and opinions about things. Like, it's a good thing, right? You don't want homogeneity across everything. But what that means is that people shouldn't be valued differently because of it, or thought down upon because of the differences. And I think that's where the sort of nuanced conversation lies, rather than saying we need to all be the same, because that's not possible. I mean, just personality and temperament means that we won't be, right? Because we have different preferences and different interests. And so that'll lead us down different paths. And so that's fine. It's good. It's how civilization functions so well. I mean, we can't all be doing the same thing. Otherwise, what we would never get anywhere, right?
Yeah.
So I do think it's an unrealistic vision, but reducing the harm is certainly a good aim to have.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, I mean, I agree with everything you say. I think it makes me think to some extent of the debate that exists, especially in this country, around freedom of expression.
Mm-hmm.
The tension between people conflating freedom of expression with the permissibility of hate speech and racism, for example. You can walk into probably any university campus and see that play out, where a student group wants to invite a speaker to speak to students, and it's somebody who is known for spreading hate speech, for example, and then people come into a debate about freedom of expression and differing viewpoints, and how we should be allowed free debate all the time, and ignoring like the harm that it does to validate certain opinions and give them oxygen in the name of freedom of expression. And I think that's something that's top of mind for me,
Mm-hmm.
especially these days.
So, I agree. But what's interesting is like how, because, and I don't by no means have any sort of solutions to these problems. We're just sort of speculating on the matter. But how do you negotiate? Because typically, um, can you still hear me? Yeah.
You just cut out for 1 second.
Oh,
So you
okay.
said,
Yeah.
yeah,
It seems to be back now.
okay.
Again with this technology. Um, I'm not even touching anything on the computer. It's just happening. How do you navigate? And I'm not asking you for an answer either. Just thinking about it is like, you know, when you suppress ideas, they don't tend to go away, right? They tend to grow in hiding, and so and then they like become like explosive when they get let out all at once, which is dangerous, right? And so, how do you toe the line between, you know, some, which I may or may, I'm not necessarily agreeing, but like between a moderation of certain speakers and topics versus suppression of those topics, where you expect that if you don't allow people to speak about things, that those things just go away and people's minds just change, which I don't think they do. And I think that when people have their opinions silenced or suppressed, it makes them like double down, right? And that's not a good thing. Now, does it mean that those people's opinions are good? No. There are all kinds, and this can happen regardless of what the debate or topic is, right? Because people on both sides feel that way. And I think everyone feels comfortable with moderation as long as it's moderating the opposing side, as opposed to themselves or, their so-called side. Now, this is a very complicated topic because by no means would I ever want harmful speech to be and for people to feel harmed. And my microphone just went funny again. It's back. What do you think about that?
I think, yeah, I think you talk about moderating debate. I think something that I've learned, and I work in for the public. I work in government,
Mm-hmm.
and I've worked in places that are, people facing, especially in uh, addressing complaints and resolving conflict with government and residents of the city of Toronto. One thing I have noticed is, um, people just want to be heard,
Mm-hmm.
I think. Um, I I feel as though, in my experience, I've noticed that a lot of the time people who take very extreme views on a subject, people who uh, let's say racism, for example, um, people are hurting in some kind of way that makes them want to lash out and hurt
Mm-hmm.
somebody else. I think, there's that saying that hurt people, right?
Yeah.
I think I think that, you know, de- debate exists, but if we take a step back and look at why these views exist in the first place, I think we can maybe agree in a lot of ways that people people are struggling, people are not being taken care of in the way that they deserve to. And um, our governments do not meet people's needs in a way that they deserve to be met. And I think that just the, complete lack of a safety net that exists for people, especially now, especially today,
Yeah.
is in part responsible for these extremely polarizing views that people have about one another. Um,
I
that's a
agree.
very broad way of answering your question.
No, no, you're right. I think that it's very important to look at the hurt that people suffer and why they're expressing this rage, right? And psychologically speaking, um, when people aren't equipped to regulate their emotions internally, they look for places to externalize them. And the internet is one of the best places you can do that because it's confrontational without the actual confrontation, right? And you can say what you like. You can even be anonymous, and um, you feel good that you've expressed this rage, regardless of where the rage comes from. And people hating on groups of people that they've never even met before. Like how many people do you know in that group who belong to that group? Have you ever spoken to them? Like, you know, at some point, if you do, you realize they're just people, right? And oftentimes they get sucked in to these various cult-like groups, right, of all kinds. I hesitate to call them cults because cults typically have leaders, but cult-like in the sense of like it's so uniform belief, right? Like if one of us, like these are the rules and these are the beliefs you have to have and have to follow, and these are the practices you have to do, which may or may not be good or bad. Does depends, right? But it is interesting why people lash out, and if you look at something like what happened with COVID, where regardless of how you think, let's say the Canadian government handled things, everyone in the world was afraid, they were frustrated, they felt trapped, they were unable to do what they wanted to do. It doesn't matter where you were in the world. Um, and then so it really, and we were all lonely, right? Because our social contact was cut basically for a lot, and that's really bad for humans. And so sorry, I'm laughing at the microphone notification that keeps popping up, not the subject matter. And so people needed a place to go to express that rage because they didn't know what to do with it, right? And, so they go online and they join these things. And the weirdest part is like you do feel like you're having some sort of an impact or doing good when you find something to be mad about, right? And at least for me, I found what would happen is like, in the beginning stages before I sort of was able to recognize it is I would feel irritated and angry and upset, and I couldn't really figure out why. But I needed something to be angry about so that this feeling makes sense, right? Instead of now, which is just you sit with it and you let it process, and it doesn't really matter why. It's a transient emotion that comes and goes, and that's okay. But before it was like, well, what am I mad about? And then you find something to be mad about, right? And you find something that opposes whatever belief system you have, and whether it's to do with COVID or this or that. It doesn't matter, right? You find the outlet and then you take it out on people. And when it's like public figures, people take it out on them as if they're sort of like personas rather than actual people, right? Because most people would never say those kinds of things to those people face to face. They just never would. Some people would, but most people wouldn't. And I don't want to meet those people who would, because that's scary shit.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We just live in a very strange time of humanity, and it's so unprecedented with the access to information that we have. It just seems crazy.
Yeah, you've nailed it. I mean, the access to information 24/7 and, misinformation 24/7. And I think that, yeah, it's, I think, the backlash to, public health regulations this past year and last year are really indicative of the impact that technology can have in turning turning people to movements that are, kind of fascist, uh, for lack of a better word. And yeah.
Yeah, and also having access to information that you want and sometimes don't want, but keep engaging with, right? And that's the suck of social media, is like what the algorithms discovered by themselves, and it's not malicious per se, but consequently is that people engage with things that activate their negative emotions more than their positive emotions. And
Hmm.
so the more you use your phone or your laptop or whatever, which we all use all damn day,
Hmm.
right? Um, is that when you're on these social media sites, whatever they are, right, there's a good chance that it's negative emotional content that you're taking in, unless you've consciously decided to curate positive content because you're sick of that negative. But to get to that point, you had to go through a lot of negative stuff, right? Which is rough because it takes its toll on you. And yet it somehow feels engaging and fulfilling while it's happening. And I think it's because of that attempt to project meaning onto the negative emotions that you're feeling. But you get caught in the cycle of then reactivating them and making them more with each post, and the whole story, never mind the attention problems. But
Yeah, the effect on our attention spans is a whole other topic.
I mean, have you ever used TikTok?
Oh, I downloaded it and I thought, what am I doing? And I swiftly deleted it.
Good. So did I. But before that happened, I would lose like 2 or 3 hours just like that. I would be like, "What's happened? I don't even know what I've just watched." And so now I won't use it anymore. I use it for promotional purposes, but not for consuming purposes, which is ethically questionable, if I'm honest. And I struggle with that as a creator, but it's neither here nor there. Because otherwise I don't have a business without
Yeah.
social media. It's very weird to be in this
It's
position.
it's true. I sometimes I think if I didn't have the novel, my book Such Big Dreams that just came out this year, would I have deleted Instagram and Facebook and stuff? And I think maybe I would have. I'm at the point where I just don't know what it's or I know what it's doing to me. I know what it's doing to my attention span, to my perception of myself, to my perception of, who I am in this world. And sometimes I just want to throw my phone away and I can't do it because I feel
Yeah,
like I have a book to promote.
for sure. Yeah, social media is a crazy world. And I also probably would have deleted my social media had I not started this podcast. And it's very complicated because there's so much good that can come from it, like what we're doing. And yet there's also so much bad that happens as a consequence. But I guess that's with everything in life.
Yeah, it brings people together who normally wouldn't have been brought together. It fosters inclusion and community, and And then it also, is a breeding ground for hate. So gosh,
Yeah.
I don't know how you regulate the internet, but someone's got to figure it out.
Yeah, I don't know either. And I don't know who deserves to have that power. That's the other problem, right? Is who gets to decide what can and can't be discussed and said. Like, that's a big problem because when people get that kind of power, they do tend to abuse it, regardless of
Mhm.
how saintly they think of themselves.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, myself included, like, that's a human risk, right? It's power um, corrupts, as they say. Perhaps not always, but very often, and at least to some degree sometimes. And that's that. It's I think it's the entitlement that you get, right? Is you get that sense of everyone cheering you on, and then you make a decision, and then it was the right decision. Even if some people disagree, you're like, yeah, but a lot of people agree, so I'm just gonna stick with it, right?
Yeah.
It's a weird form of um, power. But anyway, listen, thank you very much for coming on. This has been a lot of fun, and my apologies to you and to everyone about the technological difficulties we had today. I hope it didn't interrupt the quality of this podcast for me. Um, do you have any final thoughts? Oh, and afterwards, please promote your book and tell everyone where to get it. It'll also be in the link and everywhere else.
For sure. No, thank you so much, Shane. It was a great conversation. I could have kept talking all afternoon. But yeah, so my book is a novel. It's called Such Big Dreams. It's published by McClelland and Stewart in Canada and Ballantine Books in the United States. And you can find it anywhere books are sold. So that's, your local bookseller, your local independent bookseller, or Chapters Indigo, or Amazon, if that's where you buy books,
Everywhere.
everywhere. Yeah.
Everywhere. And I highly recommend it. It's a great book, even if you're not a typical novel reader like myself. Um, it's really cool to read a novel that's written about a culture that's sort of so different to everything that I'm used to, that it's highly educational and fun and well written. And I commend you greatly for it. And I thank you for being here. I also could have gone on forever, but as such, we have other commitments. And so for today, thank you very much. I look forward to speak to you.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks.